All right, Mona, I'm here. How are you tonight?
I'm doing wonderful. I see you, so you're doing pretty good.
Well, you don't even want to know what's led up to it, but I am 3 minutes late now, so let me get right to it. Sorry I was late.
Not a problem.
I thought the best thing to do for this evening was to spend pretty much the entire time trying to provide some support for the Quality Basic Education QBE project that's coming due in a few weeks. It's a fairly substantial number of points, and while it's not that difficult, it is cumbersome to know kind of which pieces have to fit together to get it accurate. So anyway, that was what seemed to me to make the most sense for us to spend some time on. There's a number of resources that are already posted. I just want to make sure. Sometimes maybe it's too many resources to be confusing, but the presentation I'm about to do now hopefully will be helpful. There is a 9-page item 3.2. That's probably the single most important resource in terms of the information you'll need to be able to complete this simulation. There are 2 other short PowerPoints about the QBE. There's a lecture I did in the past, item 3.8. Most of that is about giving you some examples on how to work through this. Inside the Dropbox is another video. I had a student do it a couple of years ago. She talks through how to do one of the grade levels of the simulation, so that's another resource available. There's a couple of items attached to the Dropbox, a couple of voice messages from me that would be helpful. And then the main assignment sheet, or basically what this is a simulation where you are given certain information about a school system, and at the end of the day you have to figure out how much money they get from the state based upon the specific criteria of their school. For example, how many students with disabilities they have, how many ESOL students they have, etc. So inside the Dropbox, attached to the Dropbox, is the sheet that has the different criteria that you need to follow in terms of determining what are the factors that impact how much revenue that this fictitious school system will get from the state of Georgia. So there's a lot of materials already available for you to help you through this. The next several slides, I think, are really the background information that you need to be able to understand which pieces go together to make this thing work. This isn't algebra or calculus or any complicated math, but you do need to know which parts fit together so that you can do the multiplication, division, whatever's called for. Really, there's 2 parts to the QBE. There's a basic program. There's 19 different programs, 19 different categories in the QBE where there are different weights. In other words, you get more revenue if you have, for example, a student with a lot of disabilities. That's in one category, and then you get students that are in remedial education is in another category. Middle school's in a category. Primary grades is in another category. There's 19 different weights, which essentially is the multiplier that determines how much extra money you get because of a student taking classes in those programs or receiving those services. And that certainly is an example of equity because it's not all an equal amount of money. The monies and the weights are based upon what the state believes is a fair, equitable distribution, meaning more money goes to the categories that have greater needs or greater risks. So that's one part of what you'll be calculating is revenue that comes from this basic program, which is essentially what programs the kids are being served in. Then there's a little more complicated part of the funding. This is really part 2 of the simulation. We've talked about in here before how there's a lot of difference in wealth in the state, and the state tries to help those poorer counties. So there's another part of the QBE, which is this equalization program. And essentially what the state has done is promised to supplement the local school systems that are really poor with extra state money. And there's a formula that they use to determine that. It'll be a little confusing to you when you first look at it, but with the resources I've provided through some trial and error and some feedback from me, I'm confident you all can understand this well within the next couple of weeks. But essentially, part one is revenue from basically which classes and programs the kids are in. Part two is money that comes to the poorest systems through a formula that is determined wealth-based, and the state provides more money to systems that have lesser wealth. Just again, trying to give you some more of the background. This is a number you're going to get familiar with in this simulation because this is the dollar amount that the state is giving as a base amount, as the bottom amount, as the least amount you get for one full student, full-time equivalent, FTE, full-time equivalent, or if you want to do it by segments, which is probably confusing if you don't know how this is done yet, but let me skip down to here. The state counts the students 6 times over a day. So each student in a school that attends school full-time is 6 segments, assuming she or he is a full-time student. So 6 segments is one full-time student. So if you want to take the full-time equivalent money, the $2,400, you could divide it by 6, and basically what the state is giving is $410 per segment. That's for the basic program, the smallest amount they give. Now, if you have a kid that's in one of the other categories that has extra funding, then you're going to get more money than the $2,463. The $2,463 is the minimum you get. That's the basic amount, or $410 per segment. You get a lot more than that if students are in some of the other high-risk categories. And again, just to reemphasize again, the second part of this exercise is this equalization part. And just to make this point, the state has decided a certain amount, and basically they're promising to supplement everybody up to that amount. And you have to do a basic mathematical calculation to figure that out in the simulation. So again, this is a repeat of the other slide we just looked at with a little bit more information that the basic amount of money you get is $2,463 per full-time equivalent. That's the base amount. Mona, are you still able to hear me okay? Is the technology okay?
No, I got it.
Sorry, I'm going so fast I get excited about it.
I already looked at the video that the student made, and I also print off the documents that you're talking about from the QBE, that scenario. Okay, so I'm doing pretty good. I'm tracking.
Good, good. Well, let me just point out on this slide, this is not all-inclusive, but I wanted to give you some examples of these weights that I talked about. For example, kindergarten has a multiplier or a weight of 1.6532. You'll find these weights in that 9-page document 3.2 that I mentioned earlier. This just shows you the amount of importance, if you want to say it that way, or the amount of equity that's been provided to children that are being served in certain categories or programs. There's 19 of these. I think I've only got about 6 or 7 on here. I didn't want to keep going. But you see that the high school, the 9th through 12 high school general education student, there is no extra weight. That's that $2,463. That's the flat amount you get for a regular high school student. You don't get any more for them unless they're in some of the other programs. For example, alternative education, there's a vocational education. If they're in gifted education, there could be some extra money for high schoolers that are in those programs. But you see what the state is doing here. They have said, let's put more money for the younger children. Let's try and invest the money before the children fall behind. Let's put even more money in the children that we know are at risk. That's the early intervention program, getting twice the revenue per segment that you would get for a high school student. So I just wanted you to see that one of the factors in figuring out how much money you get is getting your children, your students, counted in the proper program, because if you just leave them all in the base program, you're leaving a lot of money on the table because the base program is just a 1.0. But if you get students qualifying in these other programs, you get a lot more money from the state. So here's some other information you need to know for this to make sense. I've already told you 1 FTE is 6 segments. So if you got a full-time kid, he goes to school all day, she goes to school all day, she's 6 segments. So you got to count that kid 6 times. She may be in general ed 6 periods and may only be just that $2,463. But she may be 2 segments in gifted, she may be 2 segments in vocational, she may be 2 segments in general ed. You know, one kid can be in multiple programs, and you want to make sure that you get them in the right programs because those other categories get you more money. You want to get fired? Do this wrong. If you're an administrator and leaves money on the table, you'll get fired. Again, as we've already said, there are different amounts of revenue based on which program you're in. And as we already said, that high schooler, which is our base amount, is that $2,463.43 or $410. We've already discussed that. This will not be in the simulation because it makes it more confusing, but you do receive millions of dollars for the state for your teachers' years of experience and their degree levels. Obviously, that's the difference between a T4, a T5, a T6, and a T7. Your school system gets more money from the state for those higher levels, and obviously they get more money for the experience level of the teacher. That doesn't play in this simulation. We're leaving that out of this simulation, but I just wanted to note there's a lot of money coming to your systems from the state to pay for the teachers' degrees and their years of experience. Here's another slide of information just that you need to know for this to make sense for you. One of the things that the state did when they developed this program was they came up with this $5 million, what they call the local fair share. And basically what the state said when they approved this program back in 1985 was, okay, we'll give state money to the local school systems to help the local school systems. However, every local school system in the state is required to contribute some of their revenue back to the state, and the state simply holds it back. So just for example, if Cobb County was supposed to get $10 million from Georgia under the formula, a part of that $10 million would be held back because there would be another calculation done, a $5 million calculation would be done, and the state would determine that $750,000, I'm making these numbers up, but that Cobb County, their $5 million fair share was $750,000. Then the state would hold that back. So instead of giving them the $10 million that they think they're supposed to get, it's the $10 million minus the $750,000 fair share. The idea was for the local school systems to have some stake in the programs. The state legislature didn't want all the school systems to basically just come with their hand out all the time. They wanted them to be invested in the program and be interested in the program. And quite frankly, they're also trying to make sure that the local school systems do enough local property taxes to try to force the local taxpayers to pay a share of the school for the kids. So I know this is confusing, seems kind of weird, but an element of the program, and ultimately what you're going to have to do in this simulation, is figure out the $5 million fair share, and that's money that's actually going to be subtracted from the money that you would have assumed that they were going to get, because that's money that's held back. And again, not to throw too much at you, but it's probably like drinking from a fire hose right now. There's a basic calculation that Georgia uses to determine wealth, and that's used in part for this $5 million calculation, and it's used for what I mentioned earlier, this equalization calculation. That other part of the simulation is basically a very simple formula of multiplying the tax digest by 1 mil, which is 0.001, and then you divide by how many kids, and that will give you a wealth number. And every school system in Georgia has the exact same calculation done, and all of the districts are laid out like on a continuum, and it's determined who's wealthy and who's not based upon what these numbers tell us. And the schools at the bottom, they get extra state money to try to make it more equal to the districts that are wealthier with their own effort, that are the more well-to-do system. So again, maybe a little fuzzy in your mind right now, but there's a very basic calculation that's also a part of this determination. This is really part 2 of the simulation. And again, I'm sorry to be throwing so much information, but let's just get to a more specific example here. There's a lot of ways to do this simulation. One way I think to do it, I'm going to detail here, I think you probably want to work by grade levels and by the different funding categories. So when you go to the Dropbox and you open up the, I think it's a 2.5-page assignment sheet, it has all the information about Pleasantville, Georgia, and it tells you how many kids are in each grade level. It tells you how many of those kids are in gifted, how many of those kids are in special education category 5, etc. I think the first thing you want to get clear in your mind is you really need to work by grade level and by the different funding categories, because you need to make sure you're getting the kids counted in the proper place. Otherwise, as I said earlier, you're leaving money on the table. So one common mistake, I know it's a good thought on your mind, what you're trying to do, you can't double count kids. For example, if you're counting one kid 6 segments in special ed, she's done. You don't get to count her again. I mean, one kid is 6 segments. Sometimes students want to double count. They want to count students both 6 segments in general ed, and then they want to count them 2 segments in vocational and 4 segments in gifted. One kid can't be 12 segments. So that's a common mistake that's made. I think the best way to kind of go through it, at least the way my mind works, is working by grade levels. I want to see how many of the kids in that grade level, how many of the segments in that grade level. And remember, a segment is, a kid is 6 segments. So how much of those kids' schedules are different or are exceptions to the basic funding? Then I want to count how many are in the regular funding. I think it's easier to take the segments back to FTEs. I'll tell you why in just a minute. But then basically that's going to tell you how much money you're going to get kind of by grade level and by special category. So it would look something like this. And Mona, hopefully you're still following me.
I am.
And there's a similar example to what I'm going to do right now that's posted in the Dropbox with kindergarten. But I just picked the grade 1 here. You'll pull out the assignment sheet. It's attached to the Dropbox. It'll give you some specific information about the kindergarten kids. But the assignment sheet tells you every grade level has 20 students. That's given in the problem, so that's information that's given to you. It also tells you in the problem that in grades 1 through 3, and we're talking about grade 1 here, so grade 1 is a part of that, there are 5 children that are in special education category 5 all day. That's a given in the problem. The problem also tells you that there's 5 children per grade level, so that would include grade 1. They get early intervention services, 1 period a day. So you've got 5 children that have 1 segment a day of EIP in grade 1. And then it also says in the problem, it's given to you, each grade level except kindergarten, there are 10 students taking gifted classes 1 period a day. So that also includes grade 1. So I've got 10 students in grade 1 that get 1 segment of gifted per day. This is all the information that's given to me about grade 1 in the problem. And so I've got it all organized here. So what I think the best thing to do next is to try to convert this information into more useful information to me, which at this point would be really figuring out how many segments I have of each of the categories, because ultimately I've got to get the kids divided out into which programs they're being served in, because my money is going to come to me based upon that. So I know that may be a little difficult to read. There's a lot of information on that slide, but this is what I would do as my next step to kind of work this through in my mind. And you would do a similar process for grade 2, for grade 3, for grade 4, etc. Some of you who are good with a spreadsheet, you're probably going to want to use a spreadsheet and set up some kind of a basic formula, and for you that might be much more efficient than what I'm showing here, but I'm trying to show you kind of what's behind the numbers here. So let's go back to what we know about grade 1. We know that each grade level has 20 students, and we know that one student is 6 segments. So we know for grade 1 we have 120 segments total.
Yeah.
Agreed, Mona? Okay.
I'm practicing.
I just want to make sure we know where the numbers came from. Okay. We also know, because we just looked on the previous slide where we went through, this was all the information we know about grade 1, so now we're trying to get it in a more useful form. We know that 5 grade 1 through 3 students are mainstreamed in category 5 all day. So that's 5 students all day. That's 30 segments that we're going to get funding for category 5. Make sense?
Yes.
The only thing confusing in this, let's try to address it. It said 5 grade 1 through 3 students. So we're only working grade 1, but the program, the problem doesn't break it down further because it doesn't need to break it down further because all category 5 students get the same amount of money, whether they're grade 1, 2, or 3. So really what's important in this part of the problem is that we get them in category 5. So we have 30 segments for category 5. We also know, again from the problem that's given to us, 5 of these children in grade 1 are EIP 1 period a day. So that's 5 segments of EIP. And we also know from the problem 10 children are in gifted ed 1 segment a day. So that's 10 segments. So if I do some very simple math here, I know I've got 120 segments in grade 1. I know 30 of those 120 are the category 5 children, and I know 5 of the segments are the EIP resources, and 10 of the segments are gifted. So if I subtract those from my total, I'm left with getting regular grade 1 funding for 75 segments.
Okay.
The other 45, what is it? Is that 45? The other 55 segments, is that right? No, it's 45 segments.
45.
Okay, I'm not a good math person, obviously. The other 45 segments, we're going to get more money. There's a different amount of money that comes for those other 45 segments. So we need to keep them separate. So here's the step that I like to do, but you don't have to do it. I like to take the segments and divide them back by 6 because that's telling me of those 75 regular segments, it's really 12.5 students that we're getting regular funding for. And if I take the 30 segments for the category 5 and divide it by the 6, it's really 5 kids that we're getting funded for. And the 5-6 for the EIP is really less than 1 kid, and the gifted is just over 1.5 kids. I like to convert them back to FTEs because of this next slide, because I think my calculations are easier. Because when I use the base number, that's a per FTE number. So if I have them converted back to FTEs here like I did here, I can do my calculation very simple because I've got 12.5 kids in regular ed. I multiply it by the 2,463.43, and then I multiply it by the extra weight that's for grade 1, and these weights are all found in that 9-page document. You will calculate that you'll get just under $40,000 from the state for those 12.5 kids that are in grade 1, or if you prefer, for those 75 segments of grade 1 regular ed children. And it's the same process around the rest of the way. The category 5 kids, there's 5 FTE times the base. Look how much larger that weight is. Again, this number comes from that 9-page document. You get over $30,000 just for those 5 kids. Wow. The EIP money is just over $3,600, and the gifted money is $6,825. So I prefer to do it this way. I prefer to lay out my 120 segments and then subtract. Let me clear this page. I prefer to work by, and this is just me, there's a lot of ways to do this, but I prefer to lay out what I've got as my exceptions. Then I prefer to subtract my exceptions from my total in that grade level, and then I like to convert it back to FTEs, because to me it just makes it clearer what I'm doing when I get to this stage, which is to take my FTEs, multiply them by the base amount, and then multiply by the extra funding amount. To me, that's clean, but you would not have to do it that way. For example, you could continue to work in segments. You just have to know that when you get to this step, this number is based on 6 segments. So you would have to you'd have to really divide this by 6 and then use the smaller number, which I think is like $410. And you could do the same thing by multiplying the segments by the per segment amount, but this is a per FTE amount. So does that make sense?
It does.
Ah, great. I give myself credit. This is the part 1 of the simulation. So basically, this is where most of the money comes from. It's where most of the money for APS comes from the state, except for the money that comes for teacher salaries. And it's based upon 2 times a year. A count is done. Those counts are averaged, and you receive state revenue based on what programs children are being served in at the time that those counts take place. And I don't know what program you use in APS. Some kind of student management system is keeping all this straight, and some group of people in your district have the responsibility to make sure these data get loaded up to the state, and somebody in your school, probably a data clerk, and probably one of the administrators is supposed to supervise this, but there's a lot of responsibility that some data clerk or somebody has to make sure that the kids are in the right categories. Because, for example, if you don't bother to get these kids, let's just say you leave these category 5 kids up here in the regular, and you're costing yourself a lot of money. So it is obviously important to get the money that you've earned by the services that you're providing to the students. So that takes making sure that the student schedules are accurate in the student information system, or whatever process you use in your system to ensure that the kids' services are being reflected in their schedule. So if that makes sense, that's outstanding.
It really does. I think it makes a lot of sense to me, like I was saying, because I did look at the video, and then I tried to work the problem a little bit. I'm not real smart with it, but it does make sense.
And again, to try to make it easier for everybody, and it makes it easier for me to grade and then help you find your mistakes, when you look at the instructions, I ask you to submit your calculations so that way I can try to help you see if you have an error in calculating. And also, I have an answer sheet that has predetermined boxes on it so that I can see specifically which grade level might have a mistake in calculation and whatever. So I'll ask you all to use the grade answer sheet that's included, and you submit your work. This is one of those where I keep sending it back to you till you get it. So, and I also, let me just go to my next slide. I also gave you a new date. I extended this back another week this morning. It was originally supposed to be submitted by March 6th, but now that's a good another 2.5 weeks now for you to be able to kick this around some. So I want everybody to make a good first effort at it, but what I do after you submit it in the Dropbox, I review it. Obviously, if it's accurate, 100% accurate, I give you all my calculations so you can look at them and you can smile and be happy that you got it. But more than likely, you're probably going to have a couple of errors, and then I try to give you some feedback on how to correct the errors, and then you resubmit it. Because I want everybody to be able to do this 100% accurate. So, but that's a good start. Again, back to this. If you can do this, if you can get to this point without mistake, you're like 2/3 of the way there.
Got it. I got a question for you. Is there like a maybe like a spreadsheet that the principals use where they just drop numbers in, or they do it exactly like this?
I'm guessing the people that are the people that do this like as a part of their job, they've got some predetermined spreadsheet that somebody's created that's probably got all the formulas built in it.
Okay.
And I'm guessing, I hate to say this, I'm guessing in 99% of the situations the principals don't have anything to do with this.
I believe you.
But man, oh man, there's a lot of responsibility that goes with this. And every year we talk about this, I ask the students, why don't you check in your school to see who's got the responsibility to report this for you? Because whoever he or she is, she or he's got a lot of responsibility. And obviously the state's not playing with this. If somebody does this wrong, the state's not going to be real happy or forgiving about this. You know, they're assuming that you are paying attention to this and you're doing it correctly and you're not submitting, you know, inaccurate information. This is a way to get in big trouble with the state if you do it wrong. So
I would imagine that they have like maybe somebody at the school to do it, but then when they do it, do they send it to the district and then the district do they checks and then they send it up, or it goes from straight up?
Yeah, what you said is exactly what I expect happens, exactly. And I suppose that your business office, ultimately at the district level, is probably responsible to make sure that somebody in every school is trained or supposedly knows what they're doing. I would assume that that would be a responsibility that the business office would take. Principals probably would say they don't want to mess with this because this is like a purely business function. But I think if a principal understands this, I mean, I think it causes you to want to make sure that you get it accurate, because it really makes a lot of difference, especially in a large district when you're talking about, let's say, 75,000 kids. You know, just 30 or 40 bucks a kid is a lot of money when you're talking about 75,000 kids or something.
That's true.
So anyway, why don't you see, Mona? I don't know. You work at a school site, right?
Yes, sir.
You might ask that question because I'd be interested just if anybody really quickly knows who's responsible for that in your school. Do you have who runs?
You know, I kind of have an I believe. I think one of our instructional coaches, I think she's responsible for this because she was the one who was teaching me how to do the budget, the school budget. So I'm imagining this might fall in her lap too, because she's like the number guru for the school.
Well, boy, I tell you what, if I was her, I'd say, you want me to take that responsibility, you better pay me.
Yeah.
Because man, well, anyway. Okay, well, fair enough. So my intention tonight, as a primary objective, was really to work through how you would do part one of this exercise, and it really just repeats itself for all of the 13 grade levels, kindergarten through grade 12, although the high school and middle school tend to get lumped together because the funding is really the same for grades 9 through 12. It's the same for grades 6 through 8. It's the elementary school that have some of the more specific differences, like you get a lot more money for kindergarten than any other grade level, then you get a lot more money for first, second, and third grade than you do for fourth and fifth grade, which someday, if we ever have time, is an interesting debate or discussion to have in terms of what are the appropriate kinds of weights to put. The state's putting a lot of money on those early intervention programs, and you know, I'm not arguing with it, but it is, I think the jury's out on whether, you know, we're really getting bang for the buck. And really the high schools get a lot less funding, and it's just assumed at that level that it's presumed that, you know, we've already given our best shot at keeping students from falling behind at that point. So there's very little provided to the high school in terms of like extra remediation, etc.
Mhm.
So that's a philosophical issue. I'm not arguing with the state, but we put our eggs in the early children basket. Well, let me finish up then.
Okay.
One other thing I wanted to mention, of course, all the assignments are on the calendar. I mention this every time I have any live discussion, is that you should be working on this resource audit, part one being you collecting answers to those key questions. I believe there are 5 key questions, maybe 6. I changed the assignment a lot this semester, so I can't remember. But basically, there's 5 or 6 questions about financial practices in your school system. You need to collect as much information that describes how those processes are completed in your system. Your principal can probably help you some, but I think it's very likely you're going to need the help of some people from the district office, whether it's somebody in HR, perhaps an area superintendent could help you if you're in a large system. You might also need the help of somebody from the central office in the technology department, because one of the questions has to do with technology within the district. So your first responsibility is to collect the answers to those key questions by March 20th. You're going to submit them to me, and you're going to submit your answers to a couple of other students in the class, and you're going to receive answers from a couple of other students from different districts. So essentially, by March 21st, you should have answers for your own district, and you should have answers from a couple of other districts, so it'll give you a basis to see how what is going on in your district compares to other districts in Georgia. So it gives you some basis to see that there may be more than one way to complete that responsibility. So I'm just reminding you of that, because that's not something you're going to probably be able to throw together on March 19th. So if you run into any issues on this, those of you that are listening to this video recording, you need to let me know right away. For example, if you're not getting access to the information that you need, and if there are other students from your district in this class, it is permissible to work together on this part of it as far as collecting the answers to the key questions, because I really want to protect your central office people. I don't want them to have to meet individually with 2 or 3 different students, when if you guys would just work together a little bit, then they would only have to have 1 meeting. And as I already said, I gave you a new date for the QBE. There's a few other things in there, like another quiz. There's another discussion that's due, like I think more toward the end of March. But I would say, if I were you and prioritizing my work right now, these 2 items are clearly the most substantial, important items that I would recommend that you would be giving your most attention to right now. So having said that, that was what I wanted to share tonight. Mona, are there any questions?
I have no questions. I really don't.
Well, okay, and there's obviously nobody else in the room right now, so if that's the case, thank you for attending and not making me talk to an empty room. And again, I apologize for being 2.5 minutes late. I had a really interesting evening right before class started. So,
thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Be careful.
You as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.